Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coq YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Today, we're continuing my mini-series, Australian Lutheran Synods, where we go through the different Lutheran synods here in Australia. And by synods, I also include like independent congregations that are not in fellowship with other congregations. And here we look at the differences that separate these congregations. What do each different church teach on different theological matters? Now, I'm not going through every single theological matter because these aren't mainly the issues that they split over. This list that we're going through this series are mainly the issues that have become points of contention that have possibly led to splits in the past. If you would like for me to cover a theological topic that is not mentioned in this series, do reach out to me and let me know, and I will look into that. And I can do that at the end of this series where I can do like additional theological disagreements between the different synods. But particularly we're going through those points where there are contention. And today we're looking at the issue of women's suffrage in the church. Can women vote in the church? Because there are some churches that may allow women to vote, but they don't allow women to do other things in the church. So in our previous video, we talked about how there are churches that, while they condemn women's ordination, do allow lay women to serve in the divine service. There are some churches that forbid women from serving as part of the divine service, but they do permit women to vote. The question is really why? Well, there's really two main reasons. One is there are those who don't see it as an authoritative position. See, the older Lutheran position was that voting was a form of authority, and that, yes, even though women may have an equal vote alongside men if they're part of like a voting committee, that still gives women authority over men, because a woman's vote may outweigh the male vote, and that would be women having authority over men. So it is an authority issue. There are some, however, that they also see it as an authority issue, but they don't see it as an issue within the church because they see the divine service and the church meetings as two separate things. And we're going to discuss which churches hold to these positions as we go. The first one we're going to look at is the LCA-NZ, and they do allow women's suffrage, and of course they do so because they don't see it as like women leading and teaching and having authority over men in the church. They say, hey, women aren't having authority over men in the church by voting, so let women vote. The ELCR, the ELSA, the OELC, the AELC, the Independents, the CLC, the Aletheia or Allies, St. Jude the Apostle, my congregation, the coelc, and Pastor Vanderhawk's St. Peter's congregation, we all reject women's suffrage in the church because we do see it as an exercise of authority. We see that the women are exercising authority in the church, and that this is a position appropriate only for men in the church, and therefore women shouldn't be allowed to vote in the church. The LCMC, the Mildura Living Waters, and Edgar Mayer's Living Grace also all allow women's suffrage in the church because, again, they don't see it as an issue. Not only do they not really see it as an issue of women having authority over men, they don't really have an issue with women having authority over men since they allow women's ordination anyway. There are two groups here, though, that make an exception, and that's the Growth Lutheran Network, run by Pastor Michael Parker, and the New Lutheran Mission Australia, which do allow women to vote in their church because they don't see it as a form of women having authority over men. So I kind of talked about this in the previous video where I said things like the LMA doesn't have women serving during the divine service, and I mentioned how the Growth Lutheran Network didn't have women doing certain roles in the divine service like leading prayers or lay reading or giving out communion, but they did permit women to serve as lay lectors because they didn't see it as a leading, teaching, authoritative position. That principle applies here again with the Growth Lutheran Network and the Lutheran Mission Australia, or LMA, when it comes to women voting. They, like the LCA and Z, do not see this as a form of women exercising authority in the church. So like the Lutheran Mission Australia will prevent women from being pastors and will prevent women from serving in the divine service because they see that as a form of women leading and teaching in the church, women having authority over men in the church, but they don't see women voting as women having authority over men. Most of the micro-synods here in Australia do not allow women to vote in church, but the LMA does. There is also one other exception that allows women to vote in the church, and that's the Cassia Eldona group, but that's not because they don't see it as an authoritative position. They do see it as an authoritative position, however they do not see it as women having authority within the church. See, for those who don't know, the coelc is somewhat similar to the Eldona theologically, but women's suffrage is one of our sticking points of disagreement. There's also the new group, the CLM, or Confessional Lutheran Ministerium, that broke away from Eldona, and again, for those who don't know, the coelc and the CLM have been engaged in interchurch dialogue. We have a couple sticking points on things like justification and election, but there is also a sticking point on the issue of women's suffrage. And this really comes down to how you define the church. So really, it's a question of ecclesiology. Pastor Joshua Sullivan, he made a video on his channel, Ask the Pastor, where he addresses the Eldona's position on women's suffrage. And I would recommend you go and watch that. But basically, to summarize it briefly, what Pastor Sullivan said is that the Eldona doesn't see the church actions outside of divine service as church. So for Eldona, the church is just the divine service when people are gathering for word and sacrament. When those same people go and gather for things like, you know, the church meetings, like an AGM or a board meeting or a committee meeting, they do not consider that as church. They consider that as more, you know, like a worldly business thing, and they're saying, since that is outside of the church, then women can vote, because women aren't allowed to have authority over men in the church, but this is outside the church. We in the coelc see that differently, as do many of the other micro-synods in Australia, where we do see like AGMs and committee meetings and stuff like that as, you know, the work of the church. That the church doesn't stop being the church. And this is probably best exemplified in scripture, where at the Council of Jerusalem, they are not gathering for word and sacrament, they are gathering to discuss theology, and they are called the church at that point in time. So we would see things like this as church, whether it's a AGM, a committee meeting, a synodical meeting, a general conference, stuff like that. We, not just a coelc, but other micro-synods would see that as still part of the work of the church. It's not the divine service, but the church doesn't stop being church just once the service finished. The church is not the divine service. We see the church as the body of believers that make up that church. And so when the body of believers gather for the work of the church, whether it be for the divine service or for the practical side of the church, we would still consider that church work, and therefore women should not be permitted to vote. Now, there is some objection from like the Eldona, say, well, what about if those same people go and gather for like pizza? Does that count as church? And we'd say no, because they're not gathering for church work. If it's a church meeting that they're holding at like a pizza place, then yes, that would be a gathering of the church, because they're still gathering for the church's work. Like, the church's work is not just limited to the divine service. Now, Eldona will again object to saying, well, people shouldn't be voting on theology, and people shouldn't be voting on practices in the church. And while we don't vote on, and while it is true we shouldn't vote on theology, and one could argue about whether you vote on liturgical practices or not, you also got to ask about things like calling pastors, because we do see in scripture, and this is taught by Martin Chemnitz in the Enchiridion, that in the book of Acts and also in Paul's epistle to the Corinthians, there is a voting amongst the churches when they are calling and appointing and sending pastors. And that's clearly church work, And that's clearly a vote. And so we would ask to those people in churches like Aldona and that, would women be permitted to vote as part of a call committee to call the next pastor? They're not voting on theology, but that is a voting, that is biblical voting. And is that considered church work or not? And if it is considered church work, then that should be considered as authority within the church, and therefore women shouldn't be allowed to vote in that capacity. So that's why most of the conservative micro-synods in Australia do not permit women's voting at all. So I've done a lot of talking about the actual theology on this issue of women's voting in the church, but to really just break it down quickly, the LCNZ, the LCMC, Edgar Mayer's group, the Pentecostal group in Mildura, the GLN and the new LMA all allow women's voting because they do not see it as women exercising authority. The Aldona, or as they are in Australia, the CASIA, do allow women's voting because they do not see it as part of the church work. And all the other micro-synods in Australia, from the COELC to the AELC to the ELCR to the ELSA, they all reject women's voting outright because they do see it as part of the church's work, and they do see it as women exercising authority over men, which is rejected and condemned by St. Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 2. So, yeah, that's basically where the churches all stand on the issue of women's suffrage. The next theological issue of contention that I have in my list is the question of lay consecration. This was quite a contentious issue within the AELC, but other church bodies have spoken on the matter, whether they are for or against it, and we're going to look at that in our next video. That's just a bit of a teaser for next time. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye, and God bless.